So we're about to start chapter 11, which you will notice, it's on page 44, so you will notice if you flip over the page that it's a particularly short chapter. It's one of the shorter, if not shortest, chapters, which is interesting when you consider that the topic of this chapter is the Russia, the so-called, got to be careful what words we use over here. So that's why in the title I put the bad and the ugly question mark, because we've spoken about the good, the tzaddik. Now we've got to speak about the alternative, which is the person who apparently is on the other end of the spectrum. In fact, that's how this chapter will begin. To begin by using that expression, that this is the other end of the spectrum from the tzaddik. Whatever we have seen in the context of the tzaddik will be replicated in reverse in the context of the Russia. Problem is that the word Russia is a difficult word to use in conversation without getting people to feel uncomfortable, because the implication of a Russia is a rogue, a wicked individual, an evil individual. Those are all the associations that we have with the word Russia. So hopefully by the end of this evening, we'll start to modify that perspective on the one hand, and then we'll just make everybody feel uncomfortable from a different perspective, because then suddenly we'll realize that, you know what? Russia might actually be very close to home, shall we say. So that's the balance that we have to achieve in this chapter. However, before we begin the chapter of the Russia, which incidentally, besides being a short chapter, you'll notice that the first chunk of it will go rather quickly because we're referring to information we're already familiar with based on what we've learned in the previous chapter. So the first part of this chapter goes a little bit quicker. But before we do any of that, I'd like to draw your attention to something absolutely fascinating about the layout of Tanya, where sometimes, and we know that Tanya was written with an incredible amount of intention, to the extent that there were times that the Alter Rebbe, the author, would agonize for lengths of time over whether to use a letter or not use a letter. Put an and, right? Remember, and in Hebrew is a single letter. To put the and, not put the and, use this particular wording, that particular wording. So it is a very intentional book, and part of that intent is the intent of the layout of the chapters, which is one of the things we're going to reflect on. But I have to just share Kati's comment, which I think is brilliant. Maybe we can call the Russia a Benoni wannabe, and I hope that's the case. In many instances it is the case, but yeah, let's have a look. So the first thing, as I said, I just want to show you this. It's so fascinating that the Alter Rebbe would have structured Tanya in such a way that the chapter that deals with the Russia is chapter 11. Why is that significant? I mean, let's be honest. Is 11 a significant number in Judaism? If you had to make a list of all the numbers in Judaism that really stand out as being representative of spiritual concepts, I don't know, what numbers would you put on the list? You know what this sounds like? It sounds like the who knows one. You know? Echad mi yodeya. Right? Let's do this exercise. You know what? But seriously speaking, which numbers would you consider to be the ones that have the most positive, spiritual, holy kind of association? Okay, so there we go. So the number 7, right? It's inevitable that people are going to use the number 7. It's inevitable. 18, because Chai, that's such a significant concept in Judaism, the number 18. Here's another interesting suggestion. 1, there we go, 1. The number 1, because 1 is Hashem, 1 is Hashem, right? 1 is the number of unity, of oneness, of the purpose of creation. The purpose of the core of everything would be the number 1, right? So there you go. I think that's a good one. 10. 3. Okay, that sounds almost like an auction, right? The number 10 would be associated, obviously, with the 10 commandments and the 10 utterances of creation and the 10 sephiros, etc., etc. So that would be a very important number in Judaism. 13 attributes of faith, the 13 methods by which we can extrapolate Torah, the bar mitzvah, right? So the number 13 clearly is an important number. Okay, and so we can go. And the number 40, somebody said the number 40 because 40 days of conception, the 40 sa'ah, which is the volume of water you need for a mikveh, the 40 days that Moshe was on Mount Sinai. These are all significant numbers. I don't know that anybody would say the number 11 is a significant number in Judaism. In fact, you know what, when we make the song about one is Hashem and we're looking for something to represent the number 11, it's the stars in Yosef's dream. It's sorry. That is a little bit kind of abstract. It's not necessarily something which is front and center of the whole of Judaism. 10 Commandments versus the stars in Joseph's dream, I don't think they necessarily align. So where, if at all, do we see significance given to the number 11 in Judaism? And I say if at all. Where? There we go. Excellent. So this is what happens when people are on a Zoom and they are in the... they don't put their name as their identity. So then we get anonymous suggestions, right? So what the Koch Vaya, by the way, from the song, is the stars in Joseph's dreams. That's Koch Vaya. But Keturis, this is interesting. The Keturis, which was the incense that had to be brought twice a day in the Beis Hamikdash in the temple, was comprised of 11 ingredients. That's interesting. And we say it in our davening. We actually talk about that there were 11 ingredients that were incorporated in order to make the Keturis. So that's the only place really that you will find the number 11 referenced in the Torah. 11 ingredients of the Keturis. Now, when you have a look at those ingredients, so the Gemara makes a very interesting observation. This is the Talmud in the tractate of Tainus, where it talks about the fact that when, God forbid, the Jewish community is facing some kind of a national crisis, whether it be war, whether it be drought, or whatever the case is, so you're supposed to call a communal fast. So one of the things that it says is that when you call a communal fast, if the community excludes the Rashaim, that is not a communal fast. And what's the proof? That the Keturis included, even though the intention of the Keturis was to create a beautiful fragrance, the Keturis included a particular ingredient that was foul-smelling. And if, as the Torah says, im chisar echad misamoneh, if one of the ingredients was missing from the Keturis, chayav misa, the person either who produced the Keturis or who brought the Keturis would be guilty of a capital sin. Meaning to say, if the foul-smelling ingredient is left out of the Keturis is disqualified. From that we extrapolate that if the community excludes the Rashaim, the so-called wicked individuals from the community, that's not a community. And those prayers are not prayers that can be accepted on high, and that fast is meaningless. That's where we learn from the Keturis with its 11 ingredients. Let's dig a little deeper. Nothing in Torah is by chance. It's not because the Keturis happens to need this ingredient, therefore we learn this lesson. And the Keturis happens to have 11 ingredients, therefore there's an association with the number 11 and the Rishonim. No, it's far deeper than that. What is Keturis? What is the objective of Keturis? What does Keturis represent? What did Keturis do historically? Because it's very interesting that we have a certain dramatic episode in Judaism that had to do with the Keturis. We actually had more than one. There's the story of Korach's rebellion, which involved the Keturis as well, to eliminate those people who were aligned with Korach. But there's something very powerful about the Keturis that the Torah tells us. What is it? That when there was a plague that ravaged the Jews living in the desert, Hashem told Moshe to instruct Aaron to take the Keturis and run through the camp, because the Keturis would stop the angel of death in his tracks. In other words, the Keturis is not just something that includes negativity in its ingredients. The Keturis is something which is designed to reverse negativity. That's the goal of the Keturis. So that's something, because obviously that implies that when you include the Rasha within the community, then there is the opportunity to transform and to elevate the Rasha. If we, God forbid, exclude the Rasha from the community, then what chance does the Rasha ever have for rehabilitation? But it runs deeper than that too, because the meaning of the word Keturis, remember that Aramaic is a cousin language to Hebrew, so knowing the grammatical structures of Aramaic sometimes helps us also to understand the grammatical nature of Hebrew, which is quite interesting. And so the word Keturis in Hebrew is related to the word Ketira in Aramaic, which means a knot. Because they're cousin languages, so certain things sound almost identical but slightly different. So kesher in Hebrew. The shin becomes a tof or a tes in Aramaic, so ketira becomes a knot. In other words, the purpose of the ketoris is to create a deep bond between us and Hashem. Regular sacrifices that were brought daily in the temple, they are called korbanos, which comes from the word koroiv, to come close. But it is possible for a person to come close without necessarily connecting. That's possible. It can be a temporary thing. I come close, spend some time, do my thing, clock in, clock out. Ketoris means to become bound. It means that the level of connection between the individual who is involved in the ketoris, or who is represented by the ketoris, and Hashem is far more intimate than the connection of bringing a korban. I came along, I brought the animal, I slaughtered it, I burnt it on the mizbeach, but I didn't necessarily develop that level of binding myself to Hashem that the ketoris achieves.
Rabbi, sorry,
yeah.
Can I interrupt? I think I read somewhere that the ketoris is the most beloved for Hashem.
Okay.
That's what he loves the most.
Okay, that would make sense, right?
Makes sense for what
that would make
said,
sense.
yeah.
Correct. Exactly. That would make sense. But later on in Tanya, the Alter Rebbe is going to tell us something else about a knot. Because when do you use a knot? Either you have two separate things that you want to connect together, so you tie them together and then you knot and secure the connection between the two. Or you have something like a rope that snapped. And therefore you are required now to reconnect it. And the only way to reconnect it is to tie a knot. And so later on in Tanya, the Alter Rebbe will tell us that when, God forbid, a person loses their connection with Hashem, because we're told that Yaakov chevel nachlosoi, that the inheritance of the Jewish people represented by our forefather Yaakov is chevel, is a rope. There's a rope of connection that is the neshama between us and God. So on one end of the rope you have Hashem, on the other end of the rope you have our conscious selves. And sometimes Hashem tugs on the rope to wake us up. And sometimes we tug on the rope in order to ask Hashem to manifest bracha in our lives, or to answer our prayers, or whatever the case is. And sometimes a person could behave in such a way that they snap the rope. It's a rope, our sages tell us, that is made out of 613 threads. And so it is possible for a person to nick a whole bunch of those threads to the point that the rope snaps. And then the person realizes, oi, this is bad. I've lost my connection. And that happens to people because we go through life and we do things without considering what the effects of those things might be. And we go through life thinking we'll be okay in spite of our poor choices. And then at some point we hit what they call in the addiction world rock bottom. We hit the point of realization. You know what? I've actually done damage over here. And then we start scrambling. What am I going to do and how am I going to fix this? And so the Alter Rebbe says that when a person has had a break in their spiritual connection, then the correct thing to do is, in that particular area, to double up our efforts. So, for example, one of the things that he quotes from our sages is that if a person did X and Y and they feel that they need to do teshuvah, if the person says the Gemara used to learn 1 page of the Talmud or whatever it is that they were learning on a daily basis, they should start learning 2 pages. Because where there was a break, there needs to be a doubled effort in order to reconnect. So where there was a lack of connection, now there is a knot which represents an increased connection. So ketoris, yes, ketoris means this very deep and strong bond with Hashem, but it also alludes to the fact that it's the kind of depth of connection which is generated because somebody lost the connection. The bad smelling ingredient, the Russia, who we think doesn't belong in the community, maybe that's actually the person who creates the deepest bond when they reconnect with the community. So that's the messaging over here of chapter 11 being associated with the Russia, because the symbolism of 11 is very strongly related to the symbolism of the Russia. There's one more layer to this as well. Out of all the numbers that you suggested, and people said 1 and 3 and 13 and 18 and 40, I think the number 10 is the most generally used to represent wholesome holy structures. So in other words, when Hashem creates the world, which obviously he creates in the most perfect way, the number to represent that is the number 10. 10 utterances that were used by Asara Ma'amoris, as the Mishnah tells us in Pirkei Avos, with 10 statements, Hashem created the world. When Hashem shares his wisdom with the world, what does he share with us? 10 commandments. Because that's the perfection of the structure of holiness, greater than the holiness that is already embedded or available within the world, that he's sharing with us in the form of the Torah. So the number 10 is that number of a perfect structure of holiness. When you delve into the mystical, you learn that the human being is made up of Eser Koichos HaNefesh, 10 soul abilities, or soul facets, or soul powers. Because the structure of or the healthy structure of a holy entity is 10. So the neshama in its holistic state is a 10-faceted entity. And why is it that way? Because we are created in the image of Hashem. So when Hashem portrays himself within creation, he also does so using 10 energies, which we call the 10 sephiros. So right across the board, anytime that you have a whole, healthy, holy structure, it will be in a rubric of 10. And that's a self-contained, self-sustaining structure. In other words, the 10 sephiros energize each other, complement each other. They don't require any external input in order to exist. And by the way, this is the link between the number 10 and the number 1. Because what 1 represents is there is nothing else. There is only Hashem. As opposed to us having a relationship with Hashem, which would be represented by the number 2. There's me and there's God, and we're looking to have a relationship. The number 1 excludes the possibility of anything else. So the expanded form of the number 1 is number 10. That's a structure that is completely self-sufficient. It's a structure that doesn't require any input from anything or anyone else. And in fact, in its purest form, there is nothing else and no one else. That makes sense? So the number 10 becomes the number that symbolizes holiness. The number 1 is the number that represents God, and the number 10 represents God manifested, so to speak, into a structure of holiness. A structure that allows the possibility of creation, allows the possibility of expression, etc. Okay? So the oneness of Hashem expands out into a structure with 10 facets, which are all essentially one, and therefore the most whole form of structure that exists. So 11 then represents that there's something else besides the structure. In holiness, the structure is everything. It is godliness. In other words, this. If you, for example, buy a kettle. So I don't know how many parts there are to a kettle. I've never taken a kettle apart. But there is the casing of the kettle, there is the electrics of the switch of the kettle, there's the element that heats the kettle. You might even have that little indicator on the side how full your kettle is. It might be able to whistle. It's got a lid, it's got hinges. There's a bunch of pieces to a kettle. Let's just assume for the sake of argument that there were 10 pieces to a kettle. So that would be the structure of the kettle. It's got 10 pieces to it. So what's a whole kettle that is ready to be sold? A 10-piece kettle. Now it's ready to go. It's on the shelf. It's on special. And so everybody goes to buy it. Now you want the kettle to work. There's nothing in the system of the kettle that makes the kettle work. Nothing. Such a kettle has not yet been invented. You want your kettle to work? Plug it in. There's got to be electricity. You have an old-fashioned kettle that no longer requires electricity, you've got to put it on the stove. There is no technology of a kettle that is self-boiling. So if there are 10 pieces to the kettle, there has to be an 11th external piece that gives life to the kettle so that it can do its job. So if it was Hashem's kettle, theoretically, in other words, if Hashem created kettles rather than left it up to human beings, then kettles would self-combust. They would self-generate. There would be some kind of eternal undying energy inside the kettle that would allow it to boil anytime you needed it to boil. But seeing as a kettle is not a divine creation, it's a human invention, so therefore it's not self-sufficient. It needs something to give it power. Humans are incapable of breathing life into anything that we do, anything that we make. And I'm not going to get into the whole AI debate now and whether robots are going to take over the world, but by this principle, there can't be a self-sustaining robot. It will still need something to generate it, some external thing to generate it. Even if it knows how to plug itself in at night, it will still need some kind of an external, even if it's a solar panel on it. So it's still an external power source. When Hashem creates something, it doesn't require an external power source. So the number 10 always represents a complete structure. If it's a holy structure, 10 is enough for everything in that structure to work. If it's not a holy structure, it needs an 11th element, something from the outside to feed it. So 10 is, in Jewish mysticism, used as the number to represent holy systems, and 11 to represent unholy or disconnected systems. So the entire system is in place, the whole apparatus is there, but it can't live until it borrows energy from an energy source. There's only one energy source, and that's Hashem. So if the structure is a holy structure, there's no distinction between the structure and the source, because the structure is holy. So it already incorporates the source within it. If the structure is unholy, then the structure has no energy. It has no direct link to the source, so it's got to find a way to align itself with the source to be able to receive from the source. In chapter 6, we learned this. In chapter 6, we learned that the distinction between what we call Kedusha, holiness, and what we call Klippa, which is an obstruction to holiness, is, we said one word, Bittul. Kedusha is there to fulfill Hashem's objective. It has no personal agenda. So therefore it's completely transparent. It allows godliness to flow right through it, and therefore there's no blockage between the godly energy and the being which is living energized. So the easiest example for us is, if you look at a Torah scroll, you don't have to assign a value of holiness to the Torah scroll, because you look at a Torah scroll and you can't imagine any other purpose for it except holiness. That's what it is. That's what it does. That's what it lives for. Whereas, or an angel is a similar example. You look at an angel, it's not capable of considering an alternative to what Hashem wants. Therefore, it's considered holy. The structure just generates from within itself the source. We, as humans, are not naturally in that place. We have the capacity to be in that place, and in chapter 6 we said that. We said that a Jewish person is considered holy because we have the potential to have that level of absolute bittul, submission to Hashem. But that's not where we are naturally. Naturally, we feel distinct from Hashem, and we're constantly battling with that within ourselves. How do we align ourselves with Hashem? So if we were tzaddikim, the kind of people we spoke about in the previous chapter, whose entire life is only, remember, the last thing we learned was that the perfect tzaddik is somebody who fits into the category called B'nai Aliyah, one of the definitions of which is that their entire life is, what can I do for Hashem's purpose? That's it. That's all they care about. That's all they think about. So they live in the number 10. They live in a structure where every single facet of their being is connected with the oneness of Hashem. There's no aberration, there's no distraction, there's no obstruction. We don't live there. We live constantly trying to check, do I still have a connection? Hello? Is this connection working? That's how we spend our lives. So we belong in chapter 11. We belong in the chapter of an environment where there is a sense of disconnect between our reality and the source. If it goes to the worst extreme, which is not our reality, but if it goes to the worst extreme, then you get the world of Klippa, the world of things that are designed to obstruct godliness in the world. And Klippa in its most horrific form is death. So Ketores is the antidote to death, to plague, to Klippa. Because Ketores is the path to realign ourselves and reconnect ourselves to what we really, really are, but don't realize consciously. So what's the most appropriate number to choose for the chapter that is going to describe the Rasha? 11. Because it both describes the reality that the Rasha typically lives in, as well as the promise of hope for the Rasha. You can be Ketores. You don't have to be in number 11 only in the negative sense. You could be Ketores, because you know what the power of Ketores is? The power of Ketores is that there's another side of the spectrum. There's another possibility of the number 11. 10 is the structure, and 11 could represent the superstructure. In other words, when we talk about Sephiros, we talk about the divine energy system, we talk about 10 Sephiros, Chochmah, Binah, Da'as, etc., all the way to Malchus. But we also talk about an 11th reality, which is called Keser. Keser is such intense godliness that it cannot belong to a system. It cannot be controlled or constrained by a system. And so when a person goes through the Ketores process, in other words, that reconnection to Hashem from a place of being out in the cold and feeling distant, or as we said in chapter 7, having this yearning and thirst for Hashem because we're in Eretz Tzia v'Tzalmoves, in a place of desolation, in the shadow of death, as he said in chapter 7. So when a person comes back from that, it is such a powerful experience. It allows access to godliness which is even greater than the system. So that would be 11, so to speak, in a positive way, breaking out of the structure of 10, because obviously there's a maker of the structure. Hashem designed the structure. Hashem is not confined by the structure. And so the number 11 is, on the one hand, an incredibly appropriate number to associate with the Rasha who's living in the world of Klippa, which is an 11-faceted reality. And on the other hand, such a powerful promise of a possible future for the Rasha. So don't get trapped in the world of the Rasha. Know that there's a number 11. Know that there's the possibility of transcendence and transformation. And let that be our guide. And possibly that might explain why this chapter is really short, because the objective of this book is not to dwell on the Rasha and the failings of the Rasha as much as it is to create an aspiration for the Rasha, which we start to do from the next chapter, chapter 12. And that's why, yes, to say that the Rasha is the wannabe Benoni is not so far off, because that's what we're going to start to do, and that's going to be the primary focus of this book. Not to get caught up in who we are or where we are stuck, but rather in who we should and could become. And just on that note, I want to just, it's a little slightly off topic, but very beautiful insight that I came across over Purim, where in a Purim address that the Rebbe gave, it actually wasn't Purim, it was the day after, it was Shushan Purim. This is in 1954, so Purim was on Friday, so the public address the Rebbe made was on Shabbos. And he spoke about a very profound thought which is relevant by way of introduction to talking about the Rasha. He said that in the 1800s, in the mid-1800s, the Tsarist government, or the Tsar Nicholas, started a campaign to disassociate Jewish children from their Judaism. And the campaign was essentially to snatch children off the streets and enlist them into the Tsar's army, and the parents would have no idea where in Russia they were being held, and they would be conscripted for 15 years at least, with the hope that they'd come out on the other end completely assimilated and absorbed into Christian society with no concept of their Judaism. So it's quite painful to think about. We're at the moment dealing with the thought of children kidnapped and being held by our enemies. We don't realize that there were periods of Jewish history where that was an ongoing experience. You can imagine the trauma that families lived with. And at the time, there was tremendous effort by the Rebbes at the time to try and get some kind of Jewish messaging through to these children so that they wouldn't lose their way completely. And the stories of their sacrifice for their Judaism are some of the most dramatic stories that we have certainly in recent history, if not in the whole of Jewish history. So most of the time of they were called Cantonists. Most of the time of the Cantonists was under the leadership of the Tzemach Tzedek, who was the third Rebbe of Chabad. But the beginning of this whole process began when his father-in-law, in other words, the son of the Alter Rebbe, the author of Tanya, was the Rebbe of Chabad, the Mittler Rebbe, Rabbi Dov Ber. And so he spoke about this publicly when this Cantonist process began. He spoke about it publicly, and he asked this question in a mimer, in a discourse, which usually a mimer is focused on very deep spiritual concepts. So it's quite a profound thought that, here was this national crisis for the Jewish community, and the Mittler Rebbe was addressing it in this very deep discourse. And he essentially asked the question, why would Hashem allow a neshama, a soul, to enter this world and then be ripped away from its society, from its community, and not have the opportunity to know what it is to be Jewish? Like, why would Hashem do that? Surely the purpose of a soul is to grow as a Jewish person and to achieve in Torah and mitzvahs. So why send a soul into this world and then rob it of this opportunity? And obviously there's a lot to the discourse, but the part that the Rebbe quotes in this address that I'm telling you about from 1954, he says that the Mittler Rebbe his part of his explanation was that Hashem will never allow a neshama to go to waste, and therefore he'd create an opportunity for these individuals to have the chance to really shine in some specific area of Jewish commitment that would be so powerful it would compensate for all the other areas of Judaism they knew nothing about. Which is a fascinating thought. And taking that notion, the Rebbe then in his public address said, so the principle essentially that we have to believe as Jewish people is it doesn't matter when a person comes into contact with the meaning of Judaism, because he says the previous Rebbe had a line he used to use frequently, which is, age is not determined by your official documents. It's not determined by your passport, by your birth certificate. Age is the amount of years that you live with meaning. And so when a person turns around at some point and says, wow, I've wasted X amount of years of my life, it's actually not relevant, because it's where we go from here that counts, because the principle is that Hashem will not allow a neshama to go to waste. So as soon as a person tries to reconnect and create that ketoris, that knot, that bond between themselves and Hashem, then Hashem will give them opportunity to do whatever it is, and I'm sure it will be unique for each individual, and there's no way we could even know what it is, because it's very clear in Judaism you can't weigh up what the worth of a particular action or a particular mitzvah is. But Hashem will create the opportunity for this individual to be able to compensate for what they lost. So in the case of the Cantonist, it was not his choice. So Hashem will kind of give red carpet opportunity to do something spectacular. For those of us who made poor choices and are trying to now catch up, so as soon as we show our sincere interest in wanting to catch up, to make that kesher, that ketoris, then Hashem will give us these incredible opportunities. So it's kind of with that in mind that we look at the Rasha we're going to be learning about, or at least the two categories of Rasha that we're going to be learning about in this chapter, the so-called incomplete Rasha and the absolute Rasha, because obviously it would be ironic to use the word perfect, right? With a tzaddik, we say the imperfect tzaddik and the perfect tzaddik. Rasha, tzaddik gomer and tzaddik she'eino gomer. When you say gomer for a Rasha, you can't say perfect Rasha. That's an oxymoron. So we'll say absolute Rasha or the partial Rasha. So that's what we're going to be looking at. And he begins this conversation by quoting paraphrasing essentially a verse, which we actually saw in chapter 6 as well. And that is the verse that says, Zeh le'uma zeh asay lekim. Right? That was the verse. We quoted it fully in chapter 6. Here we're just paraphrasing it. But the verse is, Zeh le'umas zeh. That Hashem created a world of mirror images, wherein whatever you have on the side of holiness is counterbalanced by things on the side of impurity. Much in the same way, I suppose, as Hashem gave a great prophet to the Jewish people called Moshe, so then he gave a great prophet to the non-Jewish world called Bilam. It's that kind of principle where Hashem effectively creates balance in the world. So zeh le'uma zeh. Whatever exists on the one extreme is reflected on the other extreme in reverse. So Perek Yud Aleph, chapter 11. Zeh le'uma zeh. So now we're going to consider the other end of the spectrum from the perfect tzaddik we just left off with at the end of the last chapter. Rasha ve toiv loi. So the two mirror images, in a sense, are going to be the Rasha who still has good within his system, Leumas Tzadik Veraloi. And that's going to be the reverse of the Tzadik who still has negative in his system. So you can see how they're a mirror image, right? The Tzadik is almost entirely, or not almost, the Tzadik is entirely positive with some residual negativity that has no power but still remains in the system, versus the Rasha who is pretty much a Rasha, that means somebody who's not aligned with what Hashem wants, but still has good within them. And what we're going to discover is that the good within the Rasha V'toivloi is far greater than the negative that still remains with the Tzaddik V'raloi. So what's the Zeh Le'umah? We're not comparing quantity over here, we're comparing the nature of their realities. So the nature of the Tzaddik's reality is that whatever negative lives within his system is under the control of the positive. That's what we said, like having criminals in prison, So they are still criminals in the society, but they're locked up and they're secure and they can't cause any damage or any trouble. Dahainu, so what does it mean? When we're talking about this person called the Rasha, V'toiv Loi, so Rasha is a wayward, aberrant person. V'toiv Loi, there's good for them, or good in them. What that means is, that means the good that is part and parcel of their godly soul. And as we've already identified in chapter 9, the godly soul is primarily expressed through the intellect, because the intellect can afford to be objective. And in order to engage with the godly soul, you have to have honest objectivity. And we also identified that the place where goodness and where the neshama really talks and expresses itself has to also have an emotional component as well. So we said that is in the right-hand side of the heart, which is considered the part of the heart that is not so materialistic, because it's not where the blood is pumped from, it's rather where the vacuum allows the blood in. And so it represents a certain detachment from the hedonism of this world. So what do we say about the Tzaddik V'raloi? We said that Tzaddik V'raloi is Tzaddik, guided by goodness, focused on holiness, Vera, with some residual negative within them, Loi, which is completely under the jurisdiction of the positive. So that negative is never going to rear its ugly head. It's not possible. So we're saying the mirror of that is Rasha V'toiv Loi. Now, the way we understood Rasha V'toiv Loi up until this point was, here's a Rasha, it's a bad person, V'toiv Loi with a silver lining. They're not so bad. It's like here in South Africa, you occasionally hear horrific stories about people who've been the victims of violent crime. So what happens? The person says, no, they were actually very well-mannered. The criminals were well-mannered. Rasha V'toiv Loi. Bad guys, but they were like, nice bad guys. They actually spoke well. They weren't too rough, or whatever the case is. So that's pretty much how I think most people understand Rasha V'toiv Loi. Bad guy, with a little bit of good. When people say, has a good heart, means well, those kinds of things. Comes along the Alter Rebbe and he says, that's not what Rasha V'toiv Loi actually means. When we said Tzaddik V'raloi, we were talking about what kind of mastery the Tzaddik has over whatever negativity might still be within his system. So the reverse, the mirror image of that has to be Rasha V'toiv Loi, the good in the Rasha's system is under the sway of the bad. Because it's the mirror image of the Tzaddik. In the Tzaddik, the negative was under the control of the good. So the mirror Rasha person must be that the positive within them is under the sway of the bad. So let's read that inside. So the toiv, the positive that's flowing through this person's system by virtue of their godly soul, which expresses itself in the mind and in the right-hand side of the heart, that is Kafufu botel the gabe hora me'aklipa shebechol alasmoli, is under the spell of the negative, which is derived from klippa, the obstruction to Hashem, that lives in the left side, the hedonistic side of the heart. So we now have a completely new appreciation for what a rasha is. We always think that a rasha is defined by how much crime they've committed. So you get, as people say in today's world, a real rasha. That person's a real rasha, which usually means I was their victim. But here we're learning something else. A rasha is not a matter of how criminal they are. A rasha is determined by how much they are under the sway of the internal negativity. That's a rasha. וזה משחלק גם כן לריבויס מדרגויס חלוקויס. And in the same way as we said that there's a very wide range of tzaddikim that exist, from the greatest tzaddik to the so-called maybe most superficial tzaddik, there is an equally broad range of Rishoim. And he says, Rivervois Madregos, there are literally tens of thousands of manifestations of Rasha. So we shouldn't be so black and white as to say, oh, so-and-so is a Rasha. There are highly subtle versions of the Rasha, and there are very obtuse versions of the Rasha. What distinguishes one Rasha from the next? How much their negative side holds sway over them. That's the distinction. So we've got to be really careful over here and acknowledge that to call a person a rasha could be a horrific insult, or could just simply be a reality check. Depends where they are on the spectrum. If there's still part of me that is dictated to by my toxic thoughts, otherwise known as the Yetzer Hara, then I'm a rasha. And somebody else might be completely hypnotized by the Yetzer Hara. They're also a rasha. If we have learned nothing else by this point in Tanya, it is that while the Gemara did use 5 categories to describe Jewish people, it never intended for us to put those people into 5 boxes. It intended for us to appreciate that there is a broad range of each one of those very nuanced categories of people. So what's going to distinguish one rasha from the next? Be'inyan kamus ve'eichus habitul uchfifas hatov lera chas v'shalom. We'll start that this week, and please God continue it next week. What's going to distinguish the degree of rasha, how evil the person is? It's going to depend on how much the Yetzer Hara rules their life. And the only way to measure that is to understand that there are 2 parallel measures that both have to be considered. One is kamus, which we are generally good at identifying, and which lends us, causes us to be judgmental. Kamus is quantity. How many bad things does a person do? Or how often does a person do aberrant things? But the other part that completely throws our judgment out of whack and should be the reminder that you can never judge anybody is eichus, the quality of what the person does. And those are 2 things that we really have to know how to understand, not to be able to judge others, but to understand ourselves. Because if we really want to have any sense of introspection, and if we want to get to the next chapter, which is going to tell us about the aspiration to become a Beinoni, we need to be able to identify inside of ourselves the kamus and the eichus of our Yetzer Hara's stranglehold. How much, how often, and in what way. And it's in the unpacking of those things that we get a far better version of knowing what a rasha is, and then, of course, knowing how to recreate the ketoris, the kesher, the connection, the find our way back. Because if we don't know where we're coming from, or as the expression goes, that until you identify the illness, you haven't begun to heal it, but knowing the illness is already halfway to healing it. So this is really valuable information for us, and we're going to spend a fair amount of time in this chapter doing exactly that, identifying how you know the extent and the depth of the negativity that's happening inside a person. To be continued.